Gasket exam, cram session, video 11. Okay, cast iron flanges. Oh look, a set of cast iron flanges magically appear. Okay, cast iron flanges, cast iron versus steel. Steel bends, cast iron doesn't. Okay, you have a cast iron flange, and in here they're asking, let's see, for a full face gasket. So let's say we don't use a full face. Let's say we use a ring gasket. Okay, so the gasket is only going to cover the mating surfaces here. It's going to skip the bolt holes. Okay, so in a full face, boom, circle, holes for the bolts, right? Ring gasket like this, but the flange itself, the gasket is not going to cover the holes. It's just going to provide a mating surface. So we're going to do this. So another bolt hole. We completely miss the gasket. Okay. Why is this an issue for a cast iron flange? Like I said, steel bends, cast iron doesn't. Okay, you put your ring gasket in, you want to prove me wrong, you tighten it up, everything looks tight, and maybe you get a little bit of, the ends start to, come to meet each other. A little bit kind of like what would happen if this was a steel flange. And you say, look, it bent. It's okay, it's fine. It's like, sure, okay. I wouldn't walk away from it. All right. If it was a steel flange, I would say you might have put a little too much torque on it, but we can walk away from it as long as it doesn't leak. Sure, let's walk away from it. I feel okay. Walk away from that. Okay. And then later, somewhere down the line, you're going to get a call from your boss or something's going to happen and you got to answer a lot of questions because all of a sudden, all hell broke loose. Something horrible happened. Why? Because it may appear the cast iron bent, but all you did was put stress into the metal. The metal is brittle, and it didn't have to break when you were there. It waited till you completely forgot about it, and we're nowhere near the situation to crack. And once it cracks, well, usually it's going to crack when nobody's there, and nobody notices it. And it's got to fill an entire room full of just the right explosive mixture so someone can open a door, flip the switch, and boom. Okay, so for the cast iron flange, when we're putting in the gasket, we want a full face gasket because when you have the full face gasket, no matter how much you tighten, and you're going to tighten evenly, you got to go, let's say this is 1, 2, 3, 4, right? You go 1, then 2, then 3, then 4. Or you could go 1, 2, 4, 3. But whatever you tighten, you got to go to the opposite, and keep alternating your tightening so that you get an even seal around. So we're going to say you did that. And with the with the full face gasket, maybe you over torque it a little bit, but it's going to be okay because it's going to tighten evenly all the way around. All right, we're not going to have a point of leverage like we did with the ring gasket, where the ring gasket is over here, the tightening occurs here, and it's just bringing it in, putting stress into the metal, and cast iron cannot handle a lot of stress. Okay, steel can, cast iron can't. A ring gasket produces a point of leverage such that you're going to put too much torque into the ends and you're going to end up with a situation you don't want. A situation that is easily avoided if, when we're going to pick out a gasket for this joint, we're going to pick out the full face. Okay. Let's see. Question 45. Of the following, which are prohibited in a gas distribution system? Okay, this is a point of contention, confusion, and understandably so, because, before the new code, we were working off the 1968 code. The 1968 code was very specific about a couple of things it didn't want to see in the gas system. Okay? But the new code has its own set of things it doesn't want to see in the gas system. So, let's first, before I taint your mind with what used to be, let's talk about what is now. Of the following which are prohibited in a gas distribution system, tubing joints. Tubing joints are prohibited in a gas distribution system. Flare joints. Flare joints are prohibited in a gas distribution system. Bushings. Bushings are prohibited in a gas distribution system. So all of the above. Now, you're going to hear street fittings. In the 1968 code, street fittings were not allowed for gas. In the new code, they are not prohibited. You are allowed a street fitting. Okay? It says so. Well, it doesn't say you're not allowed it, but of the things you are definitely prohibited from using, street fittings are not one of them. So you can use a street fitting in today's gas system installations. Okay? You cannot use a tubing joint. So flexible copper tubing or whatever, they don't want to see that. You cannot use a flare joint. A flare joint is where you slip the nut onto the tubing, you get your flaring tool, make the flare, and then to the mating surface, which is a little rounded, you tighten it all up. Boom, you can't do that. Now, little advanced code theory, all right? We're not allowed a flare joint, but then how do we connect the stove? Because if you think about it, the flexible connector, that yellow flexi, that's flared. Okay, the adapter you're going to screw into the 3/4 valve, the adapter that is probably comes with the stove, those are flare joints. I thought we weren't allowed flare joints. Technically, we're still within the code because, as I mentioned, although I did not give you the administrative chapter of the fuel gas code, in the administrative chapter of the fuel gas code, it says the New York City Fuel Gas Code covers from its jurisdiction is the point of delivery to the outlet of the most remote valve or shutoff valve. So technically, by the code's own wording, the flexible connector to the stove is none of its business. Okay? But of course, we're going to see that even though it specifically states it's none of its business, this is the code talking, it makes it its business by telling us, well, you're only going to be able to use a semi-flexible metallic connector, and it can only be 6 feet long. It's like, I thought the code wasn't interested in that. Okay, so one of the contradictions I was telling you about with the code, and ours is not the reason why. Ours is just to figure out what the right answer is on this exam and get it over with. Okay? We don't care. We're just going to make money, yes them to death, get our fucking money, move on to the next job, right? Okay. 46. Fittings used with steel gas pipe shall be, and like I said, we're only using steel gas pipe, black pipe. It says wrought iron pipe, but like I said, we don't use that anymore. You probably never even touched it in your life. Steel gas pipe shall be, and in this case, steel, malleable iron. Okay, either A or B. Steel is steel. So general administrative code and the administrative chapter in any one of the codes will talk about using like material with like. Okay, you're using steel, you use steel. You're using copper, you use copper or brass. If you're going between two different ones, you got to use an approved adapter fitting to go between the two metals. But in addition to the blanket statement of accepted workmanship, okay, You know, that falls upon our general work ethic and doing a professional job. Materials are going to be with other materials, like materials, okay? Steel with steel. Malleable iron, okay? What is malleable iron? Malleable iron is not cast iron. It's not a cast iron fitting like, say, a steam fitting, okay? Where the iron is just poured into a mold and you have a big steam fitting, okay? Steam fittings, you know, you can tell the difference when the fittings, the bossings, or where the threading, the tapping occurs. It's nice and thick. That's because that's just straight up cast iron, straight from the smelter, you know? So you need an extra amount of meat on there. You know, with a street fitting, one of the reasons why you'd want to use it is, let's say, in a steam system, you want to take it apart, that ain't happening, just bang on it, it'll crack, you know? Malleable iron is cast iron, but it is a treated cast iron. It has a different amount of carbon in it. It's not steel, but it's less brittle. It's malleable. It's pliable. It can give and take a little. It's not going to just suddenly break at stress. It can absorb some stress and still remain intact, still remain a viable part of the piping system. So malleable iron is your usual fitting, okay? The one you probably know the most. It's the fitting where, you know, it's not smooth and shiny like, say, a steel fitting. A steel fitting you'll know because, well, it's a machined fitting, okay? They start off with a hunk of the steel already, and then they got to cut away at it, drill it, tap it. A malleable iron fitting is cheaper to produce because, well, once again, it is also poured into a mold. But that iron has a different makeup. That iron is not brittle. That iron, you'll see the bossings, you know, the raised lips or edges of the fitting where the threading occurs is not as fat, not as heavy as a cast iron fitting. So you can use it for gas. It's not going to fail as readily. Steel fitting is well, it's going to be steel, just like the steel piping. Steel fitting, very strong, can deal with a lot of pressure, will bend in ways that the piping will bend also. The only problem with steel fitting is, like I said, it requires more machining, the material is more expensive, so the fitting is more expensive, and also steel fittings, especially if we're going to go into stainless steel fittings, stainless steel pipe into stainless steel fittings, steel into steel, you're going to have an issue with galling, okay? Even if the pipe makes up, even if you're doing everything right, you still might have issues where it's just making up weird, or it's fighting you, or it's tightening up, or it's seizing up on you. That's called galling, okay? It has a tendency to gall. You have to be careful, be patient. They make Teflon tapes specifically for stainless steel piping to help with that issue. You know, that's one thing you got to keep in mind. Since we're on the topic now, and I mentioned Teflon tape, this is another controversial issue. Are we allowed Teflon on gas? Teflon is not mentioned in the New York City Fuel Gas Code, okay? So, I can't give you a definitive, absolute, can you just whip out your Teflon tape for gas? But I'm going to say, I think you can, based on this information, based on this reasoning, okay? Well, first off, if we are going to whip out Teflon tape for gas, you got to whip out Teflon tape made specifically for gas. Now, the Teflon tape for stainless steel is color-coded gray, you know, and we're talking about reputable manufacturers. We're not talking about the bargain Teflon tapes where they just put a color in there and hope you assume that that's what that's for. No. A reputable manufacturer where the color coding is actually a coating, okay, where it stands for something. So stainless steel is going to be gray. So the tape for the Teflon tape manufactured specifically for gas piping installations. Gee, God, what could that possibly be? I don't know. Yellow? Yeah, it's yellow. So that's your first step. You're going to want the yellow tape, okay? 2, in the code says you're going to use a proper dope, a proper sealant or lubricant for these joints. Workmanship already implies that you're going to know what that is. You know, you're going to recognize it when you see it, what you should be putting on a bunch of threads. The one thing it says, absolutely not. Okay, it's a very specific sentence. Okay, lamp wick, absolutely no lamp wick. Okay, lamp wick is, well, it's the wick, the thread that goes in the middle of a candle. You light it up. Well, you can also buy that and just wrap it on the threads, you know, put some dope there, seal up. No lamp wick. Lamp wick, they're worried, it's an organic material and eventually it's going to either just get pushed out of the joint when it's being made up. Teflon can't. Well, we're not going to worry about it. Lamp wick, they're worried about that, and they're worried it just breaks down over time. So, what about the Teflon tape? Where do I get the idea that Teflon tape is legal? Well, from the test itself. The test itself is a test written, sanctioned by the Department of Buildings, the author of the Fuel Gas Code. And this test is then presented to you by a third party. You know what? I should use a third party testing center, but you know what's an even better term, because this does exist with materials. Third party testing, third party certification. Gas card is certification. I know we're not inanimate objects like an appliance, but hey, third party certification pretty much describes what this card is. It's certification from a third party. A third party is involved in certification. So on the test itself, when I got the question for what are you not allowed, I had 4 choices. One of the choices was lamp wick. You are not allowed lamp wick, period. Another one of the choices was not A or B or A or C or all of the above or none of the above. None of that kind of choice. The 3 other choices were different other materials. One of them was pipe dope. You're allowed pipe dope. One of them was something else, can't remember, but it was something, that you use, correct? One of the other choices was Teflon. Now, if I got to look at the answer choices and see that I got lamp wick, which I know is stated specifically as you can't use that, then I got to assume that if you're putting Teflon, and this is a Department of Buildings examination, Teflon is going to fall as, well, that's not the right answer to the question. Teflon falls with pipe dope and the other stuff you can use. And it's like, oh, that's where I think that we're allowed Teflon, okay? Now, of course, you could present the argument, yes, but, one of the things they tell you with these tests is to select the most correct answer. It may not be the absolute correct answer. It may not be the only correct answer. But of the 4 choices, if you got to decide, you got to weigh each choice and see the most correct choice. So an argument can be brought there. But I have a feeling, who knows? We see in the next revision of the code, Teflon will finally make it. Or you gotta assume that it's just an unspoken thing that, yeah, if they see yellow Teflon on a joint that you happen to use it, they won't give you a hard time over it. If they see lamp wick, you're taking a real chance, okay? Because technically, if they see one little tiny thing wrong one place, they can't unsee that, and that's a liability on their part. They could say, you could tell me you only use it on that one joint. How am I supposed to know? Rip the whole thing out at your expense. So, no lamp wick. It's the moral of the story. No lamp wick. Okay. Let's see. Question 47. Oh, this is a good one because it builds upon what we learned that cast iron flanges, cast iron to cast iron requires a full face flange. What if we don't have cast iron to cast iron? What if we have cast iron to steel? When joining a 150-pound steel flange to a class 125 cast iron flange in a gas distribution system, what are we supposed to do? The raised face of the steel flange shall be removed. Grind it out. All right. So what are we talking about here? Well, cast iron flanges don't have a raised face. Okay. Remember, we established that cast iron is brittle. We established that we would not use a ring gasket because if we're tightening up, we created a point of leverage where now we're going to put stresses into the cast iron flange. We're going to ask it to bend. Cast iron don't bend. Cast iron break. So we need the full face gasket. It's also why you would never see a cast iron flange that has a raised face. Okay? That raised face on a cast iron flange, well, you're doomed from the start because now the raised face is providing a point of leverage. Without anything in between as you're tightening, once again, you're asking this edge to bend. Not good. So a cast iron flange is not going to have a raised face. And in keeping with that, you're not going to give it a pseudo raised face by putting a ring gasket. Okay? A steel flange, on the other hand, has a raised face. Okay? Right where we would say is the mating surfaces of the flange is the raised face. This gives you the option of using a ring gasket on a steel flange, because a full face gasket is going to have the holes in it. But when you're lining up the gaskets, all right, it's enough to line up the gaskets so the holes mate, so that you have it's a nice, smooth, easy makeup. Now, while you're lining them up, you also got to line up the gasket because you got to line up the hole in the gasket or else the bolt's not going to go through. And then you got to break out the hammer or whatever and start tapping on it ever so slightly to get it in. But you know, it's never ever so slightly, and now you're fucking messing up the threads, and now you're catching but it's a mess. All right, so what's harder to put in? The full face, because now you have to line up holes too. Ring gasket, oh, no problem. Drop it in there. The ring gasket, if you have your bolts in there already, the ring gasket is pretty much going to sit where you want it, right? And that's it. And then you're going to feed your bolts through, and you only have to worry about lining hole to hole. You don't have to move the ring gasket around, okay? And because of this raised face, and if this was steel to steel, you can crank as tightly as you want. And both of these raised faces are just squeezing onto the ring gasket, and your mating surfaces are tight and perfect. You can do that with a steel flange. But you're going from, let's say, this is an old installation to a new installation, or this is what you got. What do? Obviously, if you can't put the ring gasket for a cast iron flange because it would create a point of leverage, putting the steel flange with the raised face is a point of leverage. Even if you put a full face gasket, you still got to contend with this area here that as you're tightening is going to, sure, the steel will bend, but it's going to ask the cast iron to bend too. You're putting stress in there, you walk away, crack in the middle of the night, boom, you wake up and show up to work with a lot of explaining to do. So, take your grinder, grind this down so that this face is also smooth. Then you put your full face gasket, and now you have an acceptable joint according to the New York City Fuel Gas Code. So when joining a 150-pound steel flange, well, 150 pound means that it's standard working pressure, normal working pressure is going to be 150 psi. The class 125 cast iron flange, 125 psi. We're going to break out the grinder and grind the raised face of the steel flange to be perfectly smooth and mate to the cast iron flange and use that full face gasket. 48. Which of the following materials is not permitted for flange gaskets in a gas distribution system? Okay, well, let's start off with what you're not allowed. Okay. Well, that's what the question is. All right, let's start with what you are allowed. Sorry. Okay. B, metal. You're allowed a metal gasket. No problem. Okay. C, non-asbestos fiber. Okay. If this was, say, maybe 20 years ago, maybe even 10, don't tell nobody. Just your plain old asbestos fiber gasket. Okay. But these days, no asbestos. So whatever they're using to replace asbestos, non-asbestos fiber gasket. Okay. And spiral wound metal. Okay. That sounds pretty exotic. Offhand, I wouldn't be able to give you an example of what that might be, but it says metal. Metal's good. Metal, metal's not going to wear out. Metal, you crank down on that, that thing's going to stay for you. So, metal is a good answer. Fibers are a good answer, What are you not allowed? Rubber. Not allowed rubber, okay? Why not rubber? Okay. These days, we've long passed the point where rubber used to come from a tree. Now rubber, like a lot of other man-made synthetic materials, are polymers that we get from oil. Okay, all plastics, they're just derived from oil. Rubber these days derived from oil. So oil is one of the natural resources occurring in the ground. It's a petroleum product. Oil is a petroleum product. Coal is a petroleum product. Natural gas also falls into those petroleum products. Those, those dinosaur fuels. Let's say to make our lives easy, it's all dead dinosaurs and trees and stuff from that era. They died. The earth takes it back. Years of heat and pressure create gas, oil, coal. Okay. Oil has a tendency to, if you've ever noticed, if you have oil and rubber in contact with each other, the oil will start breaking down the rubber. It'll ruin it. Gas, being from that same family of products and that petroleum product field, gas will also start eating away at the rubber. You don't like that. What else does gas eat away at? Gas eats away at copper. It's why we don't really like, you can have tubing joints other than copper. But one reason not to have a tubing joint is because, usually it's a tendency that you're going to be using copper. Gas likes to eat away at copper. Brass stands a better chance, a brass valve, because, it's an alloy of copper, so the zinc and the tin in there protect it. And, of course, yes, there are tubing joints, but when you see these tubing joints, they're way at the end of the system. They're in the mechanisms of, let's say, a boiler gas train. And it's just a very little amount that you're using. You can see tubing joints in your stove, but the code's not harping on that. So gas is going to eat. Natural gas is pretty much methane. Gas is going to eat at the rubber. No rubber gaskets. Okay. Metal, anything that says metal sounds good. Non-asbestos fiber sounds good. Your standard rolled up gasket material that's not rubber, that you gotta hammer out, tap out, that's good. Rubber, absolutely not. Okay, so rubber, lamp wick, ring gaskets on a cast iron flange, all no-nos. Okay, bushings, no-nos. Okay. 49. When a flanged joint is opened, the gasket shall be replaced. Okay? You open the joint, I know. You open a flange joint sometimes, not a big deal. Sometimes it's a tight spot. Sometimes all you can do is barely get it open. And well, you know what? If the gasket stayed intact, that's that much less work